A couple of years ago, when I started this channel, I used to do something that I really enjoyed, and that was replicating other systems on my phone. For example, I really liked Windows 7 and how its arrow theme looked, and I replicated its UI as an Android app. And I also did the same thing for Apple's iOS. I really liked how it looked, and I made an Android app simulating iOS. And since we're in lockdown and I've got nothing to do, I decided why not go back to doing these things. So one of the things that I wanted to replicate but never really did was Samsung's Android overlay called Samsung Experience. And I don't know why, but I really liked it and wanted to replicate it but never did. So today I'm gonna be replicating it using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's get right into it. So the first thing I want to do is to add the boost screen animation. When you boot up your Android device and you see this little animation that plays, so yeah, I created an HTML file that does just that. And voila, now we have our boot animation. Now let's create our home screen. So the first thing I did is that I created an HTML file and gave it a div with a class of AppsGrid. I also added a style sheet which sets the background of the page into an image, and also some CSS properties that make the background image scale according to our display. Now inside of our div, I added a bunch of images, and these are going to be our app icons. I also refer to the W3 School's website because creating grids in CSS is kinda new to me. And now we have a grid. Added more icons and messed around with the CSS properties of the grid. Now I want to link the boost screen file with our home screen. I did this by creating a function called redirect, which is gonna redirect us to the home screen. And then I called the set timeout function, which is built in, and gave it an arrow function calling our redirect function. And I also gave it the delay time in milliseconds. And as you can see, it boots up and it redirects us to the home screen. Now I want to add the Google search bar that you find on the home screen of pretty much any Android device. I started out by creating a div and giving it a class of Google. Then I added a paragraph element inside that div and typed Google. Then I went to the style sheet and gave the Google div a white color and a drop shadow using the box shadow CSS property. Then I removed some of the icons from the apps grid and decided to add the little weather widget that you find on Samsung Experience. I kept looking at my keyboard to try and find where the degree character is, only to realize that it doesn't even exist. So I had to search for it in the Special Characters app and then copy it from there. Now I give it a white color and moved it to the center of the screen using the text align CSS property, and kept messing around with its size. I kept messing around with the padding to try and make the icons move with the screen size so you won't have to scroll to view the rest of the page if you're on a smaller screen. And I failed. I figured out that the best way to achieve this is to use the VH units in CSS. So everything is scaled according to the screen height, which eliminates scrolling. And as you can see, everything is scaled according to the screen height. Now in Samsung Experience, when you press on an app icon, it becomes a little bit darker. So let's add this to our home screen. First, I gave all of my icons a class of app. Then, in CSS, we select all of the items with class app and add a hover selector. So, when the mouse hovers over this, change some CSS properties. Then, I add a filter property and choose brightness and give it a brightness of 70%. And as you can see, it gives us the desired effect. I also want to do the same thing with the active selector. Now let's create our phone dialer app. On the right will be an image of Samsung's dialer app. This is what we want to replicate. First, I created an HTML file. Then I added an input field with a placeholder of search. Then in my CSS style sheet, I added an input selector and gave it a light gray background color. Then I gave it a border radius of 100%. Now what I want to add is, when you press on the dialer icon on the home screen, I want it to open our dialer app that we've just created. I did this by creating a variable which is gonna hold our dialer icon. Then using this variable, I added an event listener which listens to the event click. And then I give the event listener an arrow function which opens our dialer app. So when the dialer icon is pressed, then it's gonna open our dialer app. And it's not working. Let's see, what do we have wrong here? Yeah, I forgot to add a comma. This is why it's not working. Okay, now it should work just fine. So the infill feed that we just added just looks weird. Luckily, this should be a quick fix. In the CSS style sheet, with border radius, instead of using 100%, I should use 10 pixels. And now it no longer looks weird. Now there's still this ugly border that is surrounding our input field. We can get rid of it by adding the border non-CSS property to our input field. And now it looks kind of similar to the search bar from the Samsung Dialer app. Now let's add our dial pad. First I created a div and gave it a class of dial pad. Then I added a bunch of headings and inside them were the dial numbers. And now I have a dial pad. Kinda. Now I can add the grid styling that we used before. And now it looks like a proper dial pad. Next, to add our dial button. What I did is I went to Google and copied an image of Samsung Dialer and grabbed the dial button using GIMP. Now this is temporary and I'll replace it soon with another icon. And as you can see, it's there. Now I want to mess around with this size a little bit until I get what I want. And that was it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss part 2 of this video. And see you later.